Power doesn't shout. It doesn't argue on television. It doesn't rush to correct headlines or defend itself on podcasts. When power feels threatened, it does something far more effective. It goes quiet. That silence is often misunderstood. Many assume it means weakness, indecision, or avoidance. In reality, institutional silence is one of the most deliberate tools of control ever developed. Governments use it. Intelligence agencies rely on it. Monarchies have perfected it over centuries. And once you recognize how it works, you start to see that silence isn't absence. It's strategy. To understand why institutions withdraw rather than confront, you have to understand what they actually protect. It isn't people. It isn't emotions. And it certainly isn't individual reputations. Institutions protect stability. Anything that threatens long-term stability, unpredictability, escalation, narrative chaos is treated as a risk to be managed, not a problem to be debated publicly. This is where many people misunderstand how power thinks. Public culture believes conflict is resolved through confrontation. Institutions believe the opposite. Confrontation creates visibility. Visibility creates momentum. And momentum is dangerous when it can't be controlled. Instead, institutions study patterns, not what someone says once, but how they behave repeatedly. Not isolated incidents, but trajectories. Not popularity, but volatility. When those patterns suggest future disruption rather than present scandal, institutions don't attack. They contain. Containment doesn't look dramatic. There are no press conferences, no denials, no accusations, just distance. Invitations stop coming. Access narrows. Support becomes conditional. Silence replaces engagement. And here's the part most people miss. Silence is not neutral. It is evaluative. In intelligence and governance, silence often means a conclusion has already been reached internally, and further public discussion is considered unnecessary or counterproductive. Once an institution believes escalation will cause more harm than restraint, it withdraws from the narrative entirely. This is why silence can be more damaging than criticism. Criticism keeps someone relevant. Silence lets relevance decay. Institutions are patient. They operate on timelines most people don't notice. Months become years. Headlines fade. Public interest moves on. And eventually, the absence becomes normal. This approach isn't personal. It's procedural. History is filled with examples where institutions chose quiet disengagement over confrontation, not because allegations were proven, but because uncertainty itself was destabilizing. In these cases, institutions don't ask, is this person innocent or guilty? They ask, is this person predictable under pressure? Predictability is power's currency. Unpredictability forces reaction. Reaction creates risk. So when institutions step back, they're not expressing fear. They're expressing calculation. Another critical factor is narrative control. Institutions don't compete for attention. They outlast it. When narratives become emotionally charged, fragmented, or highly personalized, institutions step away because emotional narratives can't be stabilized. They evolve too quickly. They invite public participation. And once a narrative belongs to the crowd, it no longer belongs to the institution. Silence starves narratives of oxygen. Without reinforcement, stories lose coherence. They fracture. They turn inward. And eventually, they exhaust themselves. This is why institutional silence often appears cold or even cruel to outsiders. But from inside the system, it's seen as responsible governance. Emotional engagement is viewed as volatility. Distance is viewed as discipline. There is also a reputational calculus at play. Institutions don't fear scandal as much as they fear precedent. Responding publicly sets expectations. If an institution responds once, it must respond again, and again, and again. Silence avoids obligation, and once silence is established, reversing it becomes almost impossible. Re-engagement suggests reassessment. Reassessment suggests uncertainty. Institutions hate uncertainty, so they stay quiet. What's important to understand is that silence is rarely reactive. It is proactive. Decisions are often made long before the public notices the absence. By the time silence becomes visible, the internal conclusion has already solidified. This is why silence often feels final, not dramatic, not explosive, final. And that's the paradox. In a culture obsessed with noise, silence feels like nothing. But in systems built on longevity, silence is everything. Because when institutions stop talking, they're not waiting to see what happens next. They've already decided. Once institutional silence begins, the most dangerous phase isn't the public reaction. It's what happens behind closed doors. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means everything important is happening where no one can see it. Files stop moving outward and start circulating inward. Conversations become smaller, tighter, more selective. Access is reduced not loudly, but systematically. Calls are no longer returned. Invitations are delayed, then quietly withdrawn. Support doesn't disappear overnight. It thins until it no longer matters. This is how institutions disengage without triggering backlash. Because backlash requires visibility, and visibility is exactly what silence is designed to erase. What follows is something insiders understand well, but outsiders rarely recognize: reputational gravity. Once institutions step back, gravity shifts. Media coverage changes tone not because of orders, but because sources dry up. Friendly briefings stop. Context disappears. Journalists who once had background guidance now have nothing to anchor their narratives to. So stories become speculative, repetitive, and eventually stale. Silence doesn't fight narratives, it lets them collapse under their own weight. And when narratives lose institutional reinforcement, public trust slowly drains away, even if the audience can't articulate why. At this stage, individuals often make a critical mistake. They try to fill the silence. Interviews increase. Statements become longer. Explanations grow more emotional, more detailed, more urgent. But institutions read this not as clarification. They read it as instability. In systems built on restraint, over-explanation is interpreted as loss of control. The more someone tries to reclaim the narrative publicly, the more institutions retreat privately. Because power does not negotiate in public. It observes, it waits, and it lets time do the work. Another consequence of silence is network decay. Influence doesn't disappear because of scandal alone. It disappears because relationships stop compounding. When institutions disengage, third parties notice. Allies become cautious. Associations become liabilities. People who once stood close begin to reposition themselves quietly, not out of betrayal, but out of self-preservation. This creates a secondary silence, not imposed, but chosen. And that silence is even more damaging because it spreads organically. No memo is needed. No instruction is given. Everyone simply understands the shift. There's also a psychological toll that rarely gets discussed. Silence removes the feedback loop. Criticism, as painful as it is, provides boundaries. Silence provides none. It creates uncertainty. Am I being ignored temporarily or permanently? Is this cooling off or closure? Institutions know this uncertainty destabilizes individuals more effectively than confrontation ever could. Because confrontation invites defense, silence invites doubt. And doubt erodes confidence faster than any headline. Over time, silence becomes normalization. The public stops expecting responses. Media outlets stop asking. The absence no longer feels notable. It feels settled. This is the point of no return. Because re-entry after prolonged silence requires institutional endorsement, and institutions do not reverse disengagement without a compelling structural reason. Apologies don't trigger it. Popularity doesn't trigger it. Emotional appeals certainly don't. Only renewed stability does, and stability cannot be negotiated, only demonstrated over time. This is why institutional silence is often misunderstood as passive. It isn't. It's active restraint. It's long-term risk management. It's the decision that engagement costs more than distance. And once that calculation is made, it rarely changes. Power doesn't need to announce its decisions. It simply moves on, quietly, permanently, and by the time the world realizes the silence wasn't temporary, the door isn't just closed, it's no longer visible. That's the truth about silence. It doesn't end stories loudly. It ends them completely.